As an Australian company with roots tracing back to 1900, Caltex is Australia's only fuel and convenience brand listed on the Australian Securities Exchange. Proudly Australian, Caltex has grown from humble beginnings to become the nation's outright leader in transport fuels, supplying 1/3 of all Australia's transport fuel needs. Through a flexible fuel supply chain, Caltex has forged its reputation for providing safe and reliable supply of high-quality fuels to a diverse number of customer segments, including retail, mining, agriculture, aviation, transport, small to medium enterprises, marine, automotive, and government. Caltex is also one of Australia's largest convenience retailers and franchises, with over 85% of its stores operated by franchisees.
Hello, my name is Rod Rutledge and I'm the National Process Safety and Regulatory Advisor at Caltex. The purpose of this webinar is to share some insights to the process that Caltex has used to develop and implement a framework of process safety performance indicators to support our stewardship of process safety improvement. I'll also be sharing examples of where to look for good practice guidance and some successes and pitfalls we as Caltex have experienced along the way. My objective is that you will use this shared knowledge to improve this aspect of risk management in your own operations. So let's commence. In its purest sense, this webinar is applicable to companies that operate facilities or conduct operations where there is potential for a major accident involving large quantities of dangerous goods, irrespective of location, size, nature or ownership. For these companies, it's important to have an organisational framework for monitoring, reporting and governance of process safety performance indicators. The objective of such indicators is to focus attention on critical aspects of performance that can influence the likelihood or consequence of a major accident. This focus, where it is effectively designed and implemented, facilitates an opportunity to address vulnerabilities before they lead to a major accident. The learning that I'll be sharing, however, is applicable beyond the hazardous processing industries and, in my view, is applicable to any organisation that has a safety management system and seeks to better understand and improve in-the-field performance of risk controls. Before proceeding too far, it's important that I share some key definitions of terms that I'll be referring to. First of all, a process safety event or incident is an unplanned or uncontrolled loss of containment of a hazardous material from a process, operation or storage, and which poses a serious risk to health, safety or the built or natural environment. Lag KPIs are those direct measures of failure events. For example, the number of spills or injuries arising from process safety incidents. In the context of risk controls, they may also include fail to danger barrier events in normal operations, such as failure of a process trip upon an actual demand. Lead KPIs are those that relate directly to process safety risk control management activities. They are typically either measures of those activities themselves, such as schedule compliance, or of the results of those activities. For example, the number of failures detected during inspection and testing. Process safety critical control measures are those that would result in a significant increase in the risk of the associated process safety event if they were disabled or rendered ineffective. There are some key models that underpin the approach that I'll be describing. Firstly, the iceberg model is a simple model that I often use to illustrate that if you're obsessed with only measuring what you're most afraid of, then there's important and relevant data below the surface that you may be missing out on. Data that, if appropriately analysed, can assist in preventing or mitigating major accidents. To further build upon this theme, the next model is the accident pyramid, first revealed in 1931 by Heinrich to represent two key concepts. Firstly, safety accidents can be represented on a scale of escalating consequence, and secondly, that it is typical for many precursor events of lesser consequence to occur for each major accident. Heinrich drew upon his experience within the insurance industry, and although initially focused upon personal safety, the model is equally applicable to process safety. It serves to illustrate the relationship between lead and lag indicators of process safety performance. Indicators that are preventative are generally considered leading indicators and may be used to identify weakness in risk controls before an incident of higher consequence occurs. Lead indicators will typically be represented toward the bottom of the pyramid and lag indicators toward the top of the pyramid. The overall concept is one that says measure and improve matters toward the base of the pyramid, and the performance at the top end will be positively affected. The other relevant model is that of British psychologist James Reason, who developed the Swiss cheese model, shown here in one of its many adapted forms. Interpreted in the context of this model, process safety lead KPIs report on the effectiveness of individual barriers, whilst lag KPIs report on the weakness of one or a combination of barriers. Each of these models are useful in describing the interrelationship between lead and lag KPIs and the reason why each is important. So why should we measure process safety performance in this manner? And why should we invest resources in developing and implementing an effective suite of lead and lag KPIs? Fundamentally, if developed correctly, these measures inform us of process safety performance within our organisation. They provide insight to the likelihood of a major accident at a particular facility, even though the likelihood of such accidents may be very low in the industry as a whole. There are compelling reasons to measure the process safety performance of your organisation. Lead and lag KPIs assist in providing early warning that the integrity of critical risk controls have been compromised or reduced. Early warning that the likelihood of a major accident has increased, thereby providing a basis for intervention. They can also provide assurance to senior leadership and management that systems are being monitored and improved. They can also serve as the basis for a comparison of process safety performance across facilities within the same company or within an industry. In this manner, they provide a suitable reference for continuous improvement. There is also a compelling business case for effective monitoring and reporting of process safety. By taking a proactive approach to loss reduction, companies not only avoid system failures and the potential for costly incidents, they also benefit in terms of business efficiency. I often recall Trevor Kletzer's comments to us many years ago that if you think preventing incidents is costly, wait till you have a major accident and you'll really see how costly it can be. Lessons learned from major accidents of the past also provide insight to why an effective suite of lead and lag KPIs is beneficial. One notable and often repeated quote is shown here from the Baker Panel report on the 2005 BP Texas City incident. The overall compelling fact is that effective process safety performance management requires a combination of well-structured lead and lag KPIs. So why do we need to measure both lag and lead process safety performance indicators, and is there a balance required? A lot of companies rely heavily on failure data to monitor performance. The consequence of this approach is that improvements or changes may only be made after something has gone wrong. A simple way I describe why we need both lead and lag performance measures is that a sole focus on lag indicators is typically only predictive. That is, that the absolute best you can hope for is that it will inform you how likely you are to have the next adverse event that you're measuring. Don't get me wrong, this is very important. Selected appropriately, they can inform whether control improvements are gaining traction in reducing the number of precursor events and hence the likelihood of a major accident. Lead indicators, on the other hand, because they are largely risk control performance focused, are predominantly preventative. They inform how effective each barrier and combination of barriers are in preventing or mitigating both precursor events and major accidents. To manage the risk of a major accident, it's essential that the focus be shared across monitoring and reporting a data set of lag KPIs capable of measuring relevant precursor event frequency and a data set of lead KPIs capable of reporting on the health of individual risk controls or barriers. A simple example for monitoring and reporting on the health of a critical control measure for an LPG storage emergency shutdown system is shown here. It serves to illustrate the approach we have adopted in Caltex for designing appropriate lead and lag indicators for critical risk control processes. I will talk more on this design philosophy later in the webinar. I'd now like to acknowledge that there is some excellent guidance material available in the literature, which provides further detailed advice on this topic. The most quoted sources are shown here, along with a summary of their respective frameworks. At the end of the webinar, I provide details as to where these references can be sourced. There is also available an excellent case study on experience with developing process safety KPIs within Scottish Power. This case study is particularly relevant where a company's operations are diverse and complex and demonstrates what can be achieved with well-designed IT platforms. Due to the nature of its operations, the methodology that Caltex has adopted follows closely that of API Recommended Practice 754. One of the benefits of API 754 that I find particularly useful is the appendix of extensive examples to assist with interpretation of the classification criteria. I haven't found too many instances whereby reference to these examples has failed to resolve a question of classification. So let's look at some of the key steps in determining an appropriate framework for monitoring and reporting of process safety, lead and lag KPIs. Firstly, it's important to identify the organisational framework of process safety monitoring and reporting that you wish to achieve within your organisation. Safety indicators are only worth developing if they are used to drive improvement. That is, if the organisation focuses attention on them in such a way as to make a difference. As an example, you can see here a summary of Caltex's framework. We refer to it as our risk governance hierarchy. Its purpose is to use appropriate lead and lag process safety KPIs to inform each layer of management of appropriate performance information relevant to decision making at that level. Also shown here is the similar example from Scottish Power. This is an important step in achieving an effective and resilient outcome. The next step is to identify the major accident scenarios relevant to your facilities and operations. These should be drawn from hazard identification and risk assessment studies. These scenarios and their precursor events should be used to develop appropriate lag indicators. For company-wide lag KPIs, we will typically target measuring the whole number of major accidents for which there is zero tolerance, such as fatality, major fire and explosion, and at least 2 layers of precursor events beneath this. For example, large spills without ignition and smaller spills above some threshold quantity. This will normally provide a workable data set for which year-on-year performance can be more effectively measured. Having identified the major accident and precursor events, you then need to identify the critical risk controls for each major accident scenario. These should span both prevention as well as mitigation risk controls. In developing lead indicators, it's essential that they be developed with a clear knowledge of the purpose and performance requirements of the risk control and what can significantly impact this. A good example I often quote is it's no good simply measuring ESD test date compliance if the emergency shutdown system is being proved to be unreliable each time in testing. This is the principal reason why we advocate at least 2 leading KPIs for each critical risk control process, one to measure compliance to scheduled testing and the other to report on the outcome of the testing. And finally, remember my earlier point that performance indicators are only worth developing if they are used to drive improvement. That is, if the organisation focuses attention on them in such a way as to make a difference. At Caltex we do this by having a rigid framework of governance meetings that inform appropriate departmental heads, management teams and leadership teams of the lead and lag KPIs relevant to the systems they manage and their level of decision making. There are some key lessons that have influenced the continued improvement of Caltex's risk governance structure. Firstly, it's important that each level of management have an appropriate portfolio of KPIs for which it has accountability, authority to improve and a review cycle, which is typically within that of reporting at the next level of management. This is a fundamental driver of accountability. 2 features of our governance structure reflect this. First, departmental and business unit KPI reviews occur more frequently than senior leadership reviews. This ensures that accountability for meeting performance is not taken up by an inappropriate higher level of management. Second, in reporting KPIs to senior management, there is a standard by which departmental owners can flag the status of any recovery action. Within Caltex, we utilise a traffic light system whereby for each lead indicator, the responsible department can report that it is green, meeting performance requirements, amber, has not met performance requirements, but recovery will be affected in the short term, or red, has not met performance requirements, and further management assistance is required to address. This is an important feature in ensuring accountabilities are not eroded and that more senior management efforts are directed to where most needed. You can see the approach used at Caltex in these examples. The second key lesson of organisational design I would share is that within the overall Caltex framework, there is an element of intentional redundancy. By design, risk control performance is monitored both by the responsible department as well as by risk control champions. This is illustrated in the diagram shown here. In this manner, data is validated and trends across multiple facilities or production areas are able to be flagged by appropriate subject matter experts. I've mentioned that in developing lag KPIs that it's important to select not only those that report the number of high consequence incidents, but also those precursor events that can be used to measure if improvement actions are gaining traction. To illustrate this, within an organisation, it is difficult to measure performance improvement if only 1, 2 or 0 significant incidents occur in a year. An improvement from 1 to 0 incidents over a 2-year period may be false assurance that substantial improvement has occurred. If a dataset of precursor events, such as spills greater than some minimum threshold, is reported, and this creates a dataset of more than 30 such incidents in a year, then demonstration of a year-on-year improvement does hold some credibility. Within Caltex, we recognise that our lag KPIs of performance must include both types. The first, to ensure that we never lose sight of the potential to have high consequence incidents, and the second, to ensure that we have a workable data set by which we can measure improvement or regression across any reporting period. Within Caltex, our lead KPIs for process safety performance are focused on key risk control performance. In most instances, these risk controls represent systems of risk control rather than individual equipment items. Examples include permit to work system, emergency shutdown system, management of change system, training and competency system. For each of these systems, a portfolio of both lead and lag KPIs is developed. Inherent in the design of these lead and lag KPIs are the following design principles. A lead indicator that measures compliance to scheduled test activities. This measures whether we are doing what we say we should be doing to ensure the health of the risk control system. A lead indicator that measures any detected failures during inspection and testing. This measures what the routine test activities are finding. A lag indicator that measures in-service failures. This measures the instances of failure detected outside of test activities. Instances where the risk control system has been complicit in an incident is one such lag KPI. One particular aspect of the design of lead KPIs I'd like to discuss is the importance of appropriate performance criteria and targets for each lead KPI. I'd like to use an example based upon a key risk control of emergency management team response. It would be easy to develop a lead KPI of compliance to a schedule of EMT exercises and leave it at that. However, to deliver resilient performance improvement, our experience is that KPI design must reflect a depth of understanding of the desired performance. Using this particular example, Caltex performs a routine, unscheduled monthly call-out exercise which reports on the following. Did we conduct a monthly performance management call-out exercise as scheduled? Based upon the exercise results, would we be able to provide the minimum 4-person response within a 30-minute period? Based upon the exercise result, would we be able to fully man the emergency room within a 60-minute period? And in the case of any real emergencies, were there instances where performance was not met? This is the required lag KPI. Inherent in the design of these KPIs is quantitative performance criteria that reflect a knowledge of acceptable response requirements. The key messaging here is that clear, well-founded performance criteria for each lead KPI, be it an equipment, procedure or human-based risk control, is essential for a resilient outcome. In implementing a framework of process safety KPIs for your company or department, there are some pitfalls that have potential to erode outcomes. From my research, as well as my own personal experience, these may include: it is not unusual to see reported percentage compliance as a lead indicator with a target of less than 100%. This is at times justified as it provides a means to benchmark across departments or industry members. Care needs to be exercised, however, to ensure that tolerance of less than 100% performance isn't exposing the operation to unacceptable risk control weakness. An example is percentage compliance to successful ESD system testing outcomes. In most instances, Caltex now defers to use real whole numbers so as to maintain a sense of vulnerability. The next pitfall I'd like to talk about is that of a potential to become fixated on meeting KPI targets by eroding the quality of outcomes. I refer to this as becoming fixated on managing the measure rather than managing process safety. Professor Andrew Hopkins, as shown here, provides several examples of how integrity may be thus impacted. At Caltex, we strive to prevent this by having an effective layer of verification that assigned actions have been completed and validation of the quality of the outcomes. The third pitfall I'd like to discuss is that of selecting only those leading KPIs which are convenient to measure and already under good control. ABB in a recent white paper refer to this as the watermelon effect. That is, it may be green on the outside but red on the inside. It's only when suitable penetration of the true health of risk control performance is pursued that the underperformance is revealed. The next pitfall that I've sometimes detected in my career is a reluctance to incorporate KPIs which objectively report on required training and competencies for other than key operational roles. A noted example of this I often use was many years ago when reviewing the management of change process at a particular facility. I noted that the plant manager, who had responsibility for nominating which changes required HAZOP, had never been trained in either the management of change process or HAZOP. And finally, over time there is potential for an organisation to become institutionalised in its focus on process safety performance. By this, I refer to an organisation not maintaining an awareness of evolving performance standards or technologies to achieve higher levels of risk control performance within the industry. Performance expectations must evolve to demonstrate the risk is being reduced so far as reasonably practicable. A simple example I sometimes use is that of muster efficiency following a site emergency. Historically, this was performed manually, so identifying a missing person by roll call could take up to an hour on a site with several hundred employees and contractors. Today, with electronic muster systems, a missing person can be identified within 10 to 15 minutes. Today, when we conduct muster point exercises, the performance measure is pass or fail in identifying the missing person within that 10 minutes. Historically, the measure was simply whether we did the exercise. So what does all this look like if you've assembled a reasonable framework of KPIs for monitoring and reporting your process safety performance? First, the company will have a high-level set of process safety lag KPIs that reflect those major accidents that have potential to occur. This is important to maintain a sense of vulnerability across the organisation. Second, the company and relevant departments will have suitable process safety lag KPIs that provide a lower order data set of precursor events, whereby performance deterioration or improvement can be monitored. Ideally, the number of such incidents should be greater than 10 in any operating unit. Third, the company should have suitable lead and lag KPIs developed for each of the critical risk controls linked to major process safety accident scenarios. These should be monitored and reported within the relevant operating unit that has accountability for their performance. And finally, within the respective operating units, there should be clear evidence of routine governance meetings to review, assess and action what performance KPIs are reporting. The matters that I have discussed here have been in the context of process safety, but the principles are equally applicable for any personal safety, environmental or business risk, where overall risk performance is influenced by the performance and interaction of several risk controls. Within Caltex, these fundamental underlying principles of monitoring and reporting risk performance using appropriate lead and lag KPIs are utilised for a number of non-safety related risks. To me, this demonstrates that the process is recognised as value adding. So in concluding, remember that 1. Safety indicators are only worth developing if they are used to drive improvement. That is, if the organisation focuses attention on them in such a way as to make a difference. 2. You need to be vigilant for weakness in existing monitoring and reporting activities. I recommend that you make selective use of reporting redundancy, corporate audits, and include the interrogation of the effectiveness of risk control monitoring in incident investigation activities. One final point is that it's important to recognise the role that KPIs play in ensuring a resilience of risk control performance. As we all know, improvements are often passionately implemented by employees who act to implement and support a particular performance improvement. Over time, however, personnel move on, levels of knowledge and experience change, system performance may deteriorate and the sense of vulnerability diminish. System failures following a major accident often surprise some managers who sincerely believed that the controls were functioning as designed. Used effectively, process safety indicators can provide an early warning that critical controls have deteriorated to an unacceptable level. This is an opportunity that should be sought and not squandered. Before we commence our Q&A, here are some of the key references I've used at Caltex to guide our strategy in the development of process safety lead and lag performance measures. I recommend each of them to you. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for dialing into this webinar. Now it's time for some questions from the audience.
So, good afternoon again, everyone, and let's have a look at some of the questions that have come in during that webinar. I'll just have a quick look at some of these. Okay, the first question I'll take is, Rod, you mentioned that a review of risk control performance monitoring is something that should be included in major incident investigations. I'd be interested in your experience with this. Good question. Major incident investigation certainly serves as an opportunity to not only identify weakness in the actual design or implementation of a risk control or combination of risk controls, but also to examine where there may have been a breakdown in the governance that looked at that particular risk control performance. So I think it's a very relevant thing to look for in a major incident investigation. And I guess over the years of investigating a number of major accidents, certainly some of my experience has been that I've seen a combination or a significant number of different causes related to poor monitoring. In some cases, it may have been that there was just a complete absence of monitoring of a particular risk control. In some instances, it may have been that the performance or underperformance of the risk control was well identified, but there wasn't a recovery action. Or in some instances, the risk control performance may have been identified in governance, but the time frame for corrective action had been drawn out and extended on a number of occasions. And for those of you who may be interested in pursuing that response a little bit further, there's an excellent operational excellence moment that I sometimes use that comes from a US Chemical Safety Board major accident investigation of a phosgene release in the US a number of years ago. And that particular investigation struck a chord with me because it looked specifically at a history of action management or poor action management and the number of extensions that had been issued in relation to a known defect in a critical risk control. So I would certainly recommend that to you. Okay, I'll take the next question from Venkat in relation to has Caltex developed and applied performance standards for safety critical controls for its major hazard facilities? Well, the answer to that is yes, but I'd draw back on some of the comments that I made during the webinar that in most instances the process safety critical control measures that we identify in Caltex are systems of management, such as administrative controls, management of change, permit to work, but also equipment controls, such as emergency shutdown systems, pressure relief valves, etc. But each one of those, in particular the administrative controls, will have a very clear and concise documented standard that states what the performance required of that system is and why it's important to have a high performing system. So in simple response, Venkat, yes, and it's very important to document the performance standard. Now, typically those performance standards will include such things as relevant to reference to relevant standards, and also will nominate key requirements that underpin that performance. So, for example, an inspect and test interval that's required. Okay, I might take another. Okay, I'll take the question here. What are some symptoms that an organisation is too fixated on managing the metric rather than managing process safety? I think that's an excellent question once again. And I often look for how well an organisation, be it a management team or leadership team or department team, understand the connectivity between those typical lead and lag KPIs that I've spoken about in the webinar. So, for example, a really good example that I'll use is in relation to an underperforming permit to work system, where although the facility may be meeting target in relation to audits or inspections of the performance of the permit to work system, and although those audits or inspections may be revealing no significant deficiency, if the facility is still having incidents where one of the significant contributing causes is poor permit to work performance, then clearly there's a disconnect there, and that's reflective to me that the organisation may be too fixated on meeting the performance standard associated with inspect and test and managing detected defects, but really not looking at the true performance of the system. Okay, Mike asked the question, you mentioned consolidation of KPIs upwards through the organisation. Can that mask problems at the operational level? Absolutely. And I think that's why the people or the company personnel that are used to develop lead and lag performance indicators for each one of these process safety critical control measures really need to be knowledgeable about what it is that we're setting about trying to achieve. And that's why I use the example in the webinar of the emergency management performance or as a risk control and the responsiveness that's required. That really draws upon this. We really need to understand what it is we're seeking to do, not just measure whether we're doing an exercise or not, but really whether we're hitting home with the required performance. And where you can actually document that in a standard, in a performance standard for that critical control measure, it certainly aids the resilience. Because one of the key concluding thoughts that I shared with you was about the often the poor resilience of around some of the performance of these critical control measures where they're not well documented. Okay, and in particular where the performance standards for each key performance indicator is not well documented. And certainly my experience is where they are documented and they're quantitative and the organisation can measure its performance against them year on year and measure performance improvement, but also challenge whether the targets are appropriate, is certainly some of the better work that I've seen around these key performance indicators. Mark asks, will this be available as a podcast to view later? Mark, my answer to that is yes, it will be. If you go to the Caltex public website and just search for webinars, you'll see this particular series of 4 webinars will remain accessible to you. I'll just take another question here. Emma asks, does Caltex have performance standards and KPIs in place for critical equipment controls, specifically aligned with the Buncefield recommendations? Yes, it does, Emma. I'll reserve comment that it has it in place for each and every of the Buncefield recommendations, but certainly the key Buncefield recommendations. On certainly our major hazard facilities, we've conducted quite comprehensive reviews against each of the Buncefield investigation recommendations, and that has certainly been a significant feeder activity for our risk capital program. So, for example, the installation of independent high-level alarms and independent high-level trips on storage tanks, the installation of LEL gas detectors in gasoline tank compounds, etc., are all certainly the subject of risk capital improvement at Caltex facilities. And each one of those controls has a set of performance standards associated with it. I think Graham asked the question, were there any changes made to process safety indicators in Caltex as a result of learning from the Banks Meadow incident? I'll answer that one, Graham. Yes, there was. For those of you who are aware of the Banks Meadow incident, it really was a significant incident in the history of Caltex, and one that I personally was the lead investigator for that incident, and a number of the comments that I've made during the webinar today certainly originate from the investigative work that I did around the Banks Meadow incident, and in particular the performance around Caltex's management processes. And I'd just like to, I guess, refer to a number of those. The particular emergency management team example that I used during the webinar is a specific example of that, Graham. I'll just quickly have a look down here, see if there's any other significant questions. Not seeing any come up. Okay. So look, we might wrap it up there then. What I would like to certainly acknowledge is to thank everyone for dialing in today and attending the webinar and providing some excellent questions. If there are further questions, then I'd certainly encourage you to submit those via the Caltex public website on the link that's shown adjacent to the webinar. So once again, thank you very much for dialing in. I hope this webinar has been of assistance to you, and please don't hesitate to engage me directly if there are any further questions. So thank you.